The winter of 1882 didn't just arrive in Montana. It descended. Like a judgment, swift and absolute, burying the world in white. Out in that frozen wilderness, Jackson Thornhill hunted alone. His breath smoked in the frigid air as he knelt, examining tracks in the snow. These weren't deer tracks. They were human. One set of footprints, small and hurried. Another set, larger, followed with a cold and deliberate purpose. Someone was being pursued. Jackson stood, a tall, solitary pine against an endless canvas of white. He was 45, but his body held the hard-earned strength of a soldier, a life he'd left 7 years ago. He adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and followed the tracks. The wind moaned through the trees, whispering of a storm that was close, too close. He should have turned back. His cabin was 2 miles behind him, a fortress against the wild, but something pulled him forward, an invisible thread of dread. Then he saw it, a splash of crimson against the snow. Blood, still fresh. A wounded animal could explain the blood, but not the frantic pace of those smaller footprints, not the calculated stride of the hunter. He rose, eyes narrowed against the swirling flakes, and that's when the crack of a gunshot shattered the silence. Jackson dropped to one knee, rifle ready. The echo bounced off the mountains, a ghost sound from everywhere at once. He waited. Another shot rang out, closer this time. He moved toward the sound, a shadow slipping through the deep snow. The trees thinned ahead, revealing a small clearing, and in that clearing he saw movement, a flash of dark cloth against the snow. He raised his rifle. Then he lowered it. It was a child, a little girl, huddled behind a fallen pine, her dark hair dusted with snow. She couldn't have been more than 10. She turned, and her eyes widened with a terror so profound it struck Jackson like a physical blow. He set his rifle down in the snow, a deliberate act of peace. He raised his empty hands. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The girl didn't move. Her gaze darted from him to the trees behind her. She was hunted. "Are you alone?" he asked. She shook her head, then tears welled. "Please," she whispered, the word a small cloud between them. "My mama. They hurt her bad. They're coming for the mark." The mark. The words made no sense, but the terror in her voice was a language he understood all too well. "Where is she?" he asked. The girl pointed a trembling hand. "In the old shed. I ran to find help." Her voice broke. "Please hurry." Jackson picked up his rifle. "Show me." The girl, Abigail, led him through the snow. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her small face sharp with fear. "Who's after you, Abigail?" "My Uncle Vernon," she whispered, "and his men. They did awful things to Mama. Said no one would want her now. Said they had to make the mark." Jackson's jaw tightened. He knew the cruelty of men. It was why he'd sought this solitude, to escape the things he knew humans were capable of. The abandoned shed appeared ahead, half collapsed under the weight of snow. "In there," Abigail said. Jackson pushed open the sagging door. Cold air rushed out, carrying the metallic scent of blood. The interior was dim. Shadows clung to old farm equipment. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. A woman lay crumpled against the far wall, as still as death. Her dress was torn, stained dark where blood had frozen. Her head was completely shaved, the pale skin marred by cuts and bruises. She looked broken, discarded. Abigail pushed past him. "Mama, we found help." The woman's eyes fluttered open, pain but still alert. She tried to sit up but collapsed with a soft moan. Jackson knelt beside her. He saw a split lip, a bruised cheekbone. But as he gently moved her to assess her injuries, he saw something else. On the back of her neck, just below the brutal haircut, it was a brand, a strange symbol, a twisted knot of lines seared into her skin. It was fresh, the flesh around it red and angry. This was no random act of cruelty. This was a message. "Ma'am, I'm Jackson Thornhill," he said quietly. We need to get you somewhere warm. Fear flickered in her eyes. Go, she whispered. Take my girl. Leave me. I'm not leaving you, Mama, Abigail cried. Neither am I, Jackson said firmly. The woman's eyes searched his face. Then she whispered her name. Eleanor. Then her gaze clouded, and she murmured something else, a single word that chilled Jackson to the bone. Catherine. It was the name of his wife, his dead wife. Jackson carried Eleanor through the blizzard, the name of his dead wife echoing in his mind. How could this stranger, this broken woman in his arms, know that name? He pushed the question aside. Survival first. Answers later. His cabin came into view, a lone bastion against the storm. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, the warmth of the small room a welcome shock. He laid her gently on the bed. Catherine's bed. Untouched for 7 years, except for fresh linens he couldn't bring himself to remove. Seeing another woman there felt like a betrayal, but he forced the feeling down. There was no time for ghosts. While Abigail stoked the fire, Jackson gathered medical supplies. He'd learned more about doctoring in the war than he'd ever wanted to know. As he started to remove Eleanor's coat, her eyes flew open in terror. Don't, she whispered. I need to tend your wounds, he explained, his voice steady. Her gaze darted to Abigail. He understood. Abigail, he said, fill the water bucket from the barrel outside. Once the child was gone, he spoke softly to Eleanor. I need to see how badly you're hurt. She gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He worked carefully, his face betraying none of the rage building inside him. Bruises, cuts, the gash along her ribs that would need stitches. But his eyes kept returning to the brand on her neck. It was deliberate, precise, a mark of ownership. They enjoyed it, Eleanor whispered, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, taking their time. Men who hurt women aren't men, he said, his voice a low growl. They're cowards. My husband's brother, she murmured. Family. As he cleaned the last of the cuts on her scalp, his fingers brushed against something hard beneath the fabric of her tattered chemise. A small hidden pocket. Eleanor tensed. What is it? He asked. Nothing, she said too quickly. Mrs. Reed, he said, his gaze steady. If you're hiding something that puts us at risk, I need to know. After a long moment, she nodded. Inside the lining, a page from my husband's Bible. Carefully, Jackson extracted a folded piece of paper. It was torn from the Book of Psalms, but in the margins, there was writing. Not in ink. In something that looked like faded blood. It was a sequence of numbers and letters. A code. This is what they're after? He asked. She nodded weakly. My husband Harold left something with a lawyer in Boston. Vernon, his brother, wants it. But as Jackson looked closer, his blood ran cold. He recognized the elegant, precise script. He had seen it every day for 10 years on notes, on letters, in the margins of books. It wasn't Harold Reed's handwriting. It was Catherine's. The storm raged outside, trapping them in the small cabin, a fortress of logs against the howling wind and the ghosts of the past. Jackson sat by the fire, the cryptic page in his hand, his mind reeling. Catherine's handwriting. How? She had been dead for 7 years, murdered by raiders while he was away at war. Or so he'd been told. He looked at the sleeping woman on the bed, her face pale, her head shorn like a prisoner's. She knew his wife's name. She carried a message in his wife's hand. The two facts were impossible, yet they lay before him, undeniable. The night deepened. He watched over the sleeping woman and child. For the first time in 7 years, his cabin held more than just memories. It held a dangerous, living secret. He rose silently and moved to a shelf. From behind a row of books, he retrieved a small wooden box. Inside was a folded blanket, woven with intricate patterns in deep blues and reds. A gift from a Blackfoot healer who had saved his life. It holds medicine, the old man had told him. Not for the body, but for the spirit. His own spirit, he believed, was beyond healing. but he took the blanket to the bed and gently laid it over Eleanor. As he tucked it around her shoulders, he noticed Abigail watching him. "What's that?" she asked sleepily. "A healing blanket," he answered. "It will help your mama get strong." Abigail reached out and touched the colorful weaving. "It's pretty. Now sleep," he said. "You're safe here." He returned to his chair, the Bible page resting on his knee. He stared at the coded message, then at the patterns on the blanket he had just placed over Eleanor. He'd seen those patterns every day for years, a familiar decoration in his lonely cabin. But now, in the flickering firelight, with Catherine's handwriting beside them, they looked different. The swirls and lines on the blanket seemed to echo the strange script on the page. It wasn't just a code, it was a cipher key, and the key was the blanket itself. The patterns, the colors, the very threads held the secret. He carefully began to compare the two, the numbers on the page corresponding to stitches in the weaving, the letters to the sequence of colors, and slowly, agonizingly, a message began to emerge. Not an address in Boston, not instructions for a lawyer. It was a map of the very land his cabin stood on. And at the center of the map, marked with a symbol that matched the brand on Eleanor's neck, were 3 words: "Below the hearth." Eleanor woke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee. For a terrifying moment, she was back in the shed, but then she felt the softness of the bed, the warmth of a strange, beautiful blanket. Sunlight streamed through a small window. Jackson Thornhill stood by a stove, his tall frame filling the small cabin. In the daylight, she saw the lines of grief etched around his eyes, the silver in his dark beard. "Abigail?" she asked, her voice a dry crackle. "Outside," he said, bringing her a cup of water. "She's a brave girl." A few days of safety felt like an impossible luxury. As she ate the stew he offered, she studied the cabin. Orderly, sparse, but on a shelf above the fireplace was a small photograph, a woman with dark hair and a gentle smile, standing beside a younger Jackson. "Your wife?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Catherine." The name hung in the air between them, the same name she had whispered in her delirium. He didn't seem to notice, his face a mask of old pain. But Eleanor remembered. She had seen the name somewhere before, in the last days of her husband Harold's life. He had been sick, feverish, talking of things that made no sense. He spoke of a promise to a woman named Catherine, something about a secret hidden in the wilderness, something he had to protect from his brother Vernon. She had dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man. Now, sitting in Catherine's cabin, she wasn't so sure. The blizzard kept the world at bay for 3 days. A strange, quiet rhythm settled over the cabin. Jackson was kind, distant. He taught Abigail how to spot rabbit tracks in the snow. He mended things with efficient movements. Eleanor's strength returned slowly. She found a mirror and stared at her reflection. The shorn head, the cuts, the brand on her neck. Vernon had marked her as an outcast. "Hair grows back," Jackson said, standing in the doorway. "The rest heals too." There was no pity in his voice, just the practical assessment of a man who understood broken things. "Vernon said I'd be marked forever," she whispered, "that everyone would know what I was." Jackson crossed to the fireplace. "That's not an answer," he said, his back to her. "That's what someone else decided you were." As the thaw began on the 4th morning, Jackson woke from a nightmare, shouting Catherine's name. The raw pain in his voice was terrifying. Eleanor found him on the porch, staring at the melting snow. The improved weather meant travel was possible again, for them and for Vernon. "He'll come for us," she said. "We've brought trouble to your door." Jackson didn't look at her. "I opened that door." He didn't tell her about the map. He didn't tell her about the message hidden beneath his own hearth. He didn't tell her that her husband, her cruel brother-in-law, and his own dead wife were all tangled in a secret that was buried just a few feet from where they stood. He only knew that trouble wasn't coming to his door. It was already inside. The thaw made the snow soft and wet. Travel was now possible, for them and for Vernon's men. A scout was spotted at the edge of the tree line, a patient predator watching the cabin. They were found. "We should leave," Eleanor said, her voice tight with fear. "Tonight." "And go where?" Jackson asked. "The nearest town is 30 miles. You're not strong enough." "We have to! They'll hurt you to get to us. I won't have another death on my conscience." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and made a decision. "There's a way station 10 miles east. The mail carrier stops there on Thursdays. That's tomorrow. I can get a message to a friend, Sheriff Frank Sullivan in Clearwater. He'll come." 10 miles in this snow? You'll never make it back before dark. And what if they come while you're gone? "Bar the door," he said, pulling a revolver from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. "Use this." He left at first light, moving like a ghost through the misty forest. He knew these woods better than anyone, but the feeling of being watched was a cold weight on his shoulders. By mid-morning, he saw it. A thin column of smoke rising from a distant ridge. A poorly concealed camp. He pulled out his spyglass. 4 men, armed. 5 horses. The scout from yesterday was likely the 5th man. Vernon Reed was not among them. "Reed will be here by nightfall," a voice drifted on the still air. "Then we move." Jackson's blood ran cold. He had to get back. But as he turned to retreat, a twig snapped behind him. He froze. "Found something interesting, boys?" A voice called out, far too close. A man stepped from behind a pine, rifle leveled. Jackson knew him. It was a man from his old regiment. A man named Jeffers he'd seen die on the battlefield. "Jeffers? You're supposed to be dead!" The man's face twisted into a sneer. "Reports of my death were exaggerated, Thornhill, just like reports of your wife's." A shot rang out. Jackson dove, the bullet splintering the log where his head had been. He rolled, firing his own rifle. The man he knew as Jeffers staggered back, clutching his chest, a look of surprise on his face as he crumpled into the snow. Jackson didn't wait. He ran. Bullets whizzed past his head as he crashed through the underbrush, the words of the dead man echoing in his mind. "Just like reports of your wife's." He raced back to the cabin, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He burst through the door, startling Eleanor. "They're coming!" he gasped. "Vernon will be here tonight. They're going to attack." Eleanor's face went pale. "How many?" "4 plus Vernon, the scout. Won't be a problem anymore." He saw the question in her eyes. "He shot at me first." As they prepared for the siege, barricading the door and windows, Jackson knew he had to tell her the rest. The secrets were too heavy to carry alone. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "there's something else. The Bible page. It leads to adoption papers Harold filed in Boston. Abigail. She's not his biological daughter." Eleanor stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and a new kind of fear. "How do you know that?" "I found them folded with the page you gave me. It's why Vernon is so desperate. Without those papers, he can contest the will." He watched her absorb the blow, the betrayal of her husband not telling her. But he still held back the biggest secret, the one about Catherine. Because if Jeffers was right, if the reports of Catherine's death were exaggerated, then where was she? And why was her map leading him to a secret buried beneath his own home? The first alarm can rattled at the edge of the clearing, signaling the arrival of their enemy. They were here. The attack came at dusk, a barrage of rifle fire from the darkness. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin. "Thornhill!" a voice called. "Send out the woman and the girl and we'll let you live." Jackson didn't answer. He moved silently from window to window, waiting for a clear shot. He fired twice, and a cry of pain from the trees told him he'd found his mark. The attackers fell back. But then came a new threat. Flaming arrows arced through the night sky, landing on the damp roof. "Fire!" Eleanor gasped. "They're trying to burn us out!" A new voice called from the darkness, deeper, more authoritative. "Thornhill, this is Vernon Reed. I know you have my sister-in-law in there. All I want is to get her the care she needs." The lies were smooth, practiced. Jackson ignored them. The fire arrows kept coming. One lodged in the eaves, the dry wood catching, flames licking up toward the roof. Jackson flung open the door to douse it, and bullets kicked up splinters at his feet. "Eleanor, take Abigail to the cellar, now!" he yelled, slamming the door. "What about you? I'll hold them off. Go!" As Eleanor and Abigail scrambled into the hidden cellar, Jackson returned to the window. Smoke began to fill the cabin. A burning branch crashed through a window, setting the floor ablaze. As Jackson stamped it out, a bullet tore through his leg. Pain, hot and blinding, dropped him to one knee. He dragged himself to his feet, the cabin now a choking inferno. It was time. He limped to the storage room, pulled back the shelves concealing the trap door, and lowered himself into the darkness below. "Eleanor," he called softly, "it's Jackson." A match flared. She gasped when she saw his blood-soaked leg. "You're hurt." "Not badly," he lied, closing the trap door above them. The roar of the fire was a hungry beast consuming their shelter. In the dim light of an oil lamp, Eleanor bandaged his wound. "They think we're still inside," Jackson said through gritted teeth. "That gives us an advantage." "What advantage? We're trapped under a burning building." "They don't know about this cellar," he said, "or the tunnel." He nodded toward a stack of barrels in the corner. "It leads to the stream bank. I dug it after Catherine. After she died. I wanted a way out if raiders came again." As they waited for the fire to die down, huddled in the cramped earthen space, Eleanor noticed something wedged behind the barrels. A small, locked wooden box. It wasn't part of Jackson's emergency supplies. It was older, covered in dust. "What's this?" she asked. Jackson looked. "That's Catherine's," he said, his voice strained. "Her memory box. I put it down here after the funeral. I couldn't bear to look at it." Eleanor ran her fingers over the carved lid. "Did she know about this cellar?" "No," Jackson said. "No one did." But even as he said it, a terrible thought took root. The map. The message. Below the hearth. He had assumed it meant the hearth in the cabin. But what if it meant the cellar? The foundation of the hearth was directly above them. A tremendous crash shook the cellar as the cabin's main structure collapsed. "The cabin's gone!" a voice shouted from above. "Nothing could have survived that." "Search the ruins," came Reed's reply. "I want to see bodies." Eleanor shuddered. But Jackson was staring at the box in her hands. The cellar was below the hearth, and Catherine's box was here. The message wasn't about something buried below the hearth. It was about the box itself. He had been wrong about everything. They crawled through the escape tunnel in the dead of night, emerging into the cold air by the stream bank. The remains of the cabin glowed like the mouth of hell. Jackson, weak from blood loss, leaned on Eleanor as they stumbled through the forest toward a hidden cave he knew. Every step was agony. In the pre-dawn light, they reached the small cave. Eleanor helped Jackson lie down on a blanket. He was feverish, the wound on his leg angry and infected. He was dying. "If I don't make it," he rasped, "take the southern trail, find Frank Sullivan." "Don't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. While Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, Eleanor turned her attention to the box. Catherine's box. She worked at the small, rusted lock with a piece of wire from her dress, her fingers clumsy with desperation. Finally, it clicked open. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was not a trove of memories, but a small, leather-bound journal. Catherine's journal. Eleanor opened it. The same elegant handwriting from the Bible page filled the book. She began to read, and the world tilted on its axis. The journal told a story of lies and betrayal. Catherine hadn't been a simple homesteader's wife. She had a secret. Her family in the East had dealings with the Reed family business. She had discovered their enterprise was a front for a vast smuggling operation, moving stolen goods and illicit money across the territory. The symbol branded on Eleanor's neck was their mark. Harold Reed, Eleanor's husband, had discovered the truth as well. He wasn't Vernon's victim. He was his partner. But he'd had a change of heart. He and Catherine had been working together, gathering evidence, planning to expose the entire operation. Harold was trying to protect Abigail, to get his daughter's inheritance out of the blood money before the whole thing came crashing down. And the raiders who supposedly killed Catherine? They weren't random. They were Vernon's men, sent to silence her after she learned too much. But according to the last entry, dated the day before her death, she knew they were coming. "They think the evidence is in the ledgers," Catherine wrote. "But Harold and I made copies. The real proof is with someone we can trust. If I don't survive, he will know what to do. My Jackson will know." Jackson. Her Jackson would not know because he had been fed a lie. He had spent 7 years grieving a woman who was murdered not by strangers, but by the very same people hunting Eleanor now. As the sun rose, a sound from outside startled her. Abigail, posted as a lookout, came running in. "Mama! Men are coming! They're wearing stars!" Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through Eleanor. She stumbled out of the cave and saw 3 riders. "Jackson Thornhill!" one of them called out. "It's Frank Sullivan! Where are you?" Eleanor waved her arms, calling out, "Here! We need help! He's been shot!" The sheriff, Frank Sullivan, dismounted and hurried into the cave. His face was grim as he looked at his friend. "Vernon Reed did this," Eleanor said, her voice shaking as she held out the journal. "It's all in here." Frank took the journal, his eyes scanning the pages. His expression hardened. "I know Vernon Reed," he said, his voice cold. "And I knew Harold. He came to me a year ago. Said he was in over his head, wanted to get out. He was my informant." Another twist. Harold hadn't just had a change of heart. He had been actively working with the law. "He was supposed to meet me with the evidence," Frank continued, "but he never showed up. We just assumed Vernon got to him first." He looked from the journal to the unconscious form of his friend. "Looks like he and Catherine had a backup plan." A deputy was sent riding for a doctor. As they waited, Frank knelt by Jackson. "Hang on, you stubborn ox," he muttered. "You got a lot of things to answer for when you wake up." Eleanor knew then that their ordeal wasn't just a fight for survival. It was the final chapter of a story Catherine and Harold had started years ago. A story of justice, and it was up to them to finish it. The trial of Vernon Reed was the biggest event Clearwater had ever seen. The small courthouse was packed. Vernon sat at the defense table, his face a mask of arrogant confidence. He'd hired an expensive lawyer from Billings who painted Eleanor as a hysterical, grieving widow and Jackson as a violent recluse who had kidnapped her. But their story fell apart piece by piece. First, Sheriff Sullivan testified, presenting Catherine's journal as evidence. The detailed account of the smuggling ring, the names, the dates. It was all there. Then, Dr. Williams described Eleanor's injuries, stating that the brand on her neck was a deliberate, torturous act. When Eleanor took the stand, the lawyer tried to twist her words. "You fled into a blizzard with your daughter," he sneered. "Isn't that the act of an unstable mind?" "It was the act of a mother protecting her child from a monster," Eleanor replied, her voice ringing with clarity. She looked directly at Vernon. "He beat me. He starved me. He marked me like an animal. But he made one mistake. He underestimated me." The final, most powerful testimony came from Jackson. He walked to the stand with a cane, his leg still healing, but his gaze was iron. He told the court everything. About finding Eleanor and Abigail. About the siege on his cabin. About the 7 years he spent believing a lie about his wife's death. "Vernon Reed didn't just try to murder us," Jackson said, his voice low and steady. His eyes locked on Vernon. "He murdered my wife. He stole 7 years of my life. And he did it all for greed." When the jury returned, it took them only 10 minutes. Guilty, on all counts. As Vernon was led away in chains, he stopped and looked at Eleanor. His face was no longer arrogant, but twisted with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Blood tells, sister. The truth will come out." His words were a final, desperate threat, but they held no power. The spell of fear was broken. 3 months later, a wagon rolled up the trail to Broken Fir Creek. Jackson sat at the reins, Eleanor beside him, her hair now a soft cap of brown curls. In the back, Abigail pointed excitedly at the clearing. The burned ruins were gone. In their place was the foundation of a new, larger cabin laid by Frank Sullivan and volunteers from the town. They had been to Boston, found Harold's lawyer, and secured the adoption papers and the inheritance. The money, cleaned of its criminal past, would provide for Abigail's future. But they had decided to come back. Home, Abigail sighed from the back of the wagon. Jackson looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked. "This life, it's not easy." Eleanor placed her hand on his. "I've never been more certain." But as they began to unload the wagon, Jackson paused. Vernon's last words echoed in his mind. "Blood tells." It was a strange phrase, and Catherine's journal had one last cryptic entry he hadn't understood. Harold hid the ledgers. Not in a bank. Not with a lawyer. He said the father's sin is buried with the son. Frank Sullivan, who had ridden up to help them, looked at the foundation. "Harold's father was a stonemason, you know," he said idly. "Helped build the original mission downriver. He was buried in the churchyard there. The father's sin is buried with the son. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a location." Jackson, Eleanor, and Frank rode to the old mission churchyard. They found the gravestone of Harold's father, and beside it, a smaller, newer stone. Harold Reed, Jr., a son who had died in infancy years ago. A son Eleanor never even knew Harold had. Following a hunch, they dug. And a few feet down, they found a lead-lined box. Inside were the original ledgers, detailing decades of crime, implicating powerful men across the territory. Harold hadn't just been an informant. He had set a final trap from beyond the grave, ensuring that the entire criminal enterprise would be brought down with his brother. Vernon hadn't just lost his freedom, he had lost everything. Back at the clearing, as the sun set behind the mountains, Jackson, Eleanor, and Abigail stood on the foundation of their new home, a family forged in fire and ice, built on the ashes of the past. They had faced down evil and won. They had found justice for Catherine and Harold. And in the heart of the Montana wilderness, they had found each other. They were finally home. If you believe that the strongest families are the ones we choose, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground, but found in the people who stand beside you when the world burns down.